So I would like to welcome everybody to the Center for Cultural Affairs at Indiana University. And today we are very pleased to have Dr. Rachel Skaggs from the Ohio State University, where she is the Lawrence and Isabel Barnett Assistant Professor of Arts Management. Rachel is trained as a sociologist, and her research work is about, especially in the creative industries, how workers, especially sort of independent entrepreneurs and creative talents, sort of make their careers. Rachel is nothing if not prolific, because just last week I was introducing her at the ICCPR to present some of her work on this on an entirely different study. So if you're writing a paper a week, that is really great. So anyway, welcome, Rachel, and we're really interested to hear the work you have been doing on managing through COVID. I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And I'm not writing a paper a week. This project, obviously, like everyone else, this was not something that was on my radar more than a year ago. So it's something that is in addition to the work that I've been doing on songwriters and other arts entrepreneurs. I'll go ahead and share my screen so that we can get into it. And yeah, so thank you to CCA for having me today. I'm really excited and of course sad that we can't be in person, but glad that this allows so many of us from different places to all be together. So I'll be presenting today some work in progress about artist challenges and resilience after/during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this work has been supported by Ohio State through their Arts and Humanities Discovery theme, and also is in partnership with SNAAP, with the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. As you'll see, this is a mixed methods project that is still in progress, and I'm very much leaning on the workshop part of the title for this event, because I'll try to present for about half the time, and then I'm really looking for feedback about translating the qualitative findings into relevant, instructive survey questions to ask to arts graduates. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So I just have a few kind of background literature things that you all are familiar with. So first, just being that work in the arts is precarious, but at the same time, it's subject to this kind of creativity-induced resilience. So people talk about artists being precariously situated in their labor markets, but also being flexible, resilient, open to generating opportunities, and innovative. So there's this kind of paradox, right, between this kind of nimble, precarious, privileged, but downtrodden worker. And part of that has to do with the way that we measure who counts as an artist. And so thinking about the ways that artists are measured across diverse areas of practice that might have different skills, different educational requirements, and importantly, different types of employment relations. So thinking about the self-employed artist versus the artist who's in-house at, let's say, a design firm. There's a lot of differences that are subject to both their area of artistic practice and just the work conditions that they face as being either a freelance or free agentic worker compared to being an employee. So these are things that we all have to contend with. So during the most comparable recent national event to COVID, the Great Recession, Joanna's research tells us that artists were disproportionately affected compared to other types of workers. So many artists left formal employment for self-employment, and maybe also left the arts for non-arts employment. So with this in mind, it's important to think about the potential kind of push and pull factors that might lead artists to changing their work, their creative practice, and their lives based on kind of these exogenous shocks, like, well, I don't know what else would be like this moment in time, but with different types of national economic events. So more specific to COVID, Richard Florida and Michael Seaman have established that COVID is just devastating to the American creative economy, with initial losses at 30% of all jobs and 15% of total monthly wages. So this is, that report came out kind of early in the crisis, and we can expect to see, relatedly, lots of challenges to the creative economy and to creative workers both. Gendered self-ratings of job satisfaction and productivity when measured before and during COVID diverged. So women saying at the beginning of this study, they said that there was no difference between men and women in job satisfaction or productivity. But after COVID, we see that there are some inequities that are happening based on caregiving responsibilities and other kinds of factors that are happening during COVID. So as a sociologist, this is really important to me and something that I think is reflected even in the initial qualitative findings that we expect to also be present in the survey findings. So also artists, collectors, and gallerists, kind of the visual art world at the beginning of COVID, found that the digital art world, so moving things online, was less engaging and less able, importantly, to produce the types of mutual understandings, experiences, and trust that an in-person, face-to-face art world has for them. So this was especially within the kind of sales and opportunity generation area. But then also in the kind of artist social life area, the kind of hybrid work and social life that leads to a lot of opportunities and potential jobs for artists. And then a question that's coming up in research is the question of whether COVID is an exogenous crisis or simply an exposure of the kind of fractures and cracks that already exist in this area. So we know that the arts are unequitable, and we know that artists have precarious existences. So is this crisis something that is really putting additional pressure on, or is it something that's exposing the cracks that are already there? So there's a lot more kind of literature that's emerging every day from this. It's been really interesting to conduct a literature review in real time. And it's kind of nice actually to limit Google Scholar searches to 2020 and beyond when I'm looking for COVID specific things, though we already do know quite a bit about the arts that can lead us to hypothesize about what to expect. So getting to my research question, for this project, I'm asking to what degree arts graduates have experienced challenges and or resilience during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in doing that, I'm hoping to address some acute empirical questions about what artists' experiences have been during this time. But I'm also interested in some of these longer term theoretical questions. So thinking about that paradoxical nature of artists as being both precarious and nimble, or the kinds of financial challenges and potential for opportunity that we could measure during this time. So that being said, this project, like I said, is multi-method. So I'm about right here at the moment, having conducted some initial interviews with artists, and now I'm using those interviews to develop survey questions that will be fielded on the SNAAP survey, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, which will go to tens of thousands of arts graduates. So building up from our 65 interviews to hopefully a larger, more generalizable sample of arts graduates. And then it's my goal to then conduct follow-up interviews in the fall of 2022 to really get at some of those questions of opportunity and potential resilience that artists might experience based on COVID-19. So moving directly into some of the interview findings and interview studies. So this piece of the presentation will focus on interviews with arts graduates during this first year of COVID-19. Some of the questions that we asked on the interview are focused on labor market and then focused on personal well-being and looking forward past this crisis to see what the future of the sector might be. So in terms of labor market questions, some representative questions on this interview guide include before COVID-19, tell me what a normal day would look like for you. And then the follow-up, of course, of what that is like now. How have your interactions with others in your professional life changed during COVID-19? How, if at all, has the pandemic affected your productivity or ability to work? And how, if at all, has the pandemic affected you financially? In terms of personal well-being and looking forward, some of our questions include, how has COVID-19 affected you outside of your career and professional roles? What do you need to help you sustain a creative life and work now and in the future? And then the last question, which has been really interesting, is what do you envision for the future of the cultural sector? And I won't get too much into that today, but it's really interesting for artists who have had to stop the work that they're doing, thinking about the potential for a more sustainable and kind of positive cultural sector after this. I think a lot of people have realized how extractive and kind of difficult this work has been on their body, on their social lives, on their family lives, and taking this step back has perhaps helped them envision what something else might look like in the future. Also, people talked quite a bit about the racial reckoning that's happened in the last year, and even unprompted, this came up in probably 60% of the interviews when looking at the future of the cultural sector. So while this presentation will not focus on that question, those are some initial insights into what artists, at least the artists who I spoke with, are thinking about during this time. So in terms of the interview study itself, I did this study with the assistance of 3 PhD level research assistants who have helped so much. It's my first time getting to manage a project and have research assistants, and it's great. I've been able to accomplish so much more based on their invaluable assistance. So first, based on the literature review and emerging media, based on coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, we conducted a literature review and developed the interview guide with some of the questions that I just shared with you. The interviews were conducted from November 2020 to this month, March 2021, and we've interviewed 65 arts graduates with a mean time of 56 minutes. So interviews took about an hour. In terms of age, we had 42 was our mean age. So we were speaking with people who were not necessarily directly out of college, but we did have quite a wide scope. A few were just recent graduates. We did have a few retirees, but most people fell somewhere mid-career, mid to early career, I would say. Unfortunately, our sample was 86% white, only 14% non-white. So in the follow-up interviews, this is something I'd really like to work to diversify. While this is reflective of the past SNAAP research, it's actually pretty in line with the proportion white of past SNAAP studies. They're actively working toward diversifying their sample as well. So this is something that I think really needs to be attended to in the future. But beyond that, we also have a pretty even spread in terms of gender and gender identity, and have paid attention to LGBTQ plus community membership, disabled individuals, individuals who are married and single, and then people who have children, which, as you might have seen with emerging research in this area, this has been a big kind of split point between people who have children that they're caring for during the pandemic and those who don't. It's a huge space of inequality here. We also have a pretty good spread of metropolitan to urban, suburban, and rural residents, and a pretty good national kind of scope. In terms of educational attainment, most of our sample had a master's degree, but we do have a little bit of a spread there. And then the time elapsed since degree on average is 15 years. So again, kind of established to mid-career folks. Occupational diversity was quite broad. So we're really happy with the spread between visual, performing, media, arts, and then arts administration, arts educators, art historians, and architecture and design graduates, which again is reflective of the SNAAP survey to which these questions will be generalizing. Many people were multidisciplinary in their practice, and many of them found changes in their income, not surprisingly. So only 25% of the interviewees were making the majority of their income from art during this time period. A lot of them said if you had asked this 6 months before that wouldn't have been the case. And just under a quarter were union or trade organization members. So with all of that context being said, I'm happy to kind of dive into a few representative quotes from different interviews. As I said, this study just concluded this month, so we haven't had a full systematic analysis of all of these results yet, but these are some just initial findings before we get to the both inductive and deductive coding over the summer for these empirical results. So first I'll focus again on challenges, and then I do have one slide of resilience quotes. But first we have some challenges by Linda Edwards, who is a writer and literary editor who's 46 years old. All of these names are pseudonyms. So Linda says, it's just hard to have that sort of menacing thought in your brain of this thing that you love more than anything else and that you really wanted to make an entire life out of might not be possible. And that's just something like the pandemic is just like showing you that in the starkest way possible. It's really hard not to feel like I've been fooling myself for years and that the pandemic is just showing me that that's the bottom. So Linda's experiencing here a lot of the kind of loss of the psychological benefits of working in the arts. So often we say that people are doing a trade-off, so less kind of economic capital, more psychic benefits. But this was a trend that we found across these interviews, that people were losing the kinds of positive parts of their jobs that they liked, that was really kind of pulling them down much more than economic problems. So she goes on to comment on the economic piece of this. She says, you know, I just think it's like everything. And we're fortunate because we really do have safety nets and no one's going to starve. This is in her family, obviously. Not all artists. But as far as earning new money in this current literary market, I'm just going to have to find a new way for that. So she and her wife are both literary writers and editors, and they found that there were kind of no new jobs coming. And while they had the economic wherewithal to weather this storm, that the psychic rewards were just gone. And there was this kind of existential questioning of whether or not that she's been fooling herself. And this was something that came across quite a few interviews, this idea of loss of career trajectory, loss of opportunities that they believe might never come again. So quite a few people talked about things that should have happened in 2020 that were canceled, and just the feeling that those opportunities would never again present themselves, and that would be a much more catastrophic loss and setback than any immediate financial concerns. So also speaking about some challenges, these are quotes from Lindsay Green, who's a multidisciplinary artist. She does music performance, art education, and musical theater, and she's 29 years old. She says, I hate to say it because I like seeing people get super inspired to get creative and stuff like that. But a lot of times I'm not feeling it. Like I have a hard time wanting to create. I have a hard time wanting to even practice. Some days I think it has to do with, like, this might sound existential, but it's like you feel let down by your profession. Because like this thing that you've worked so hard to make a living out of, all of a sudden there are no jobs anymore. So she felt this real loss of creativity, and also just couldn't make herself practice her instrument. So she went weeks and months at a time without practicing. She said she wouldn't even let her students get away with this, but it's something that she couldn't make herself do. She goes on to say, like, if you don't have students, you don't have a way to make a living with it anymore. And it's hard to put a ton of effort into it, not knowing if I'm going to get anything out of it. Obviously, like, yeah, I love it and I love music and all that, but you know, it's been a struggle wanting to be creative lately. So even though she had a feeling that she might want to be creative, want to make new opportunities for herself, she talked about a few different strategies for doing that. She just couldn't make herself do it ultimately, and felt really stuck. So again, it isn't the proximate financial concerns that were the problem. It's this loss of purpose or loss of psychic benefit that comes with the job. Our last challenges slide is by a glass artist and arts administrator, Josephine Dean, who's 38. And she talks about some of the more kinds of physical constraints of COVID as an artist. So she says, with glass blowing, it's because like you have to have people around you, have to be really close to other people. It's not very COVID safe unless you are in a pod or something. And I do have a couple of friends that where we trust each other, and we've been blowing glass, but very minimally. I think we blew glass maybe twice during the pandemic. So she physically can't do her work. And this is something that we found, again, is split between the kinds of different types of artists across different practices. Some artists were very able to do their work at home, and some were just not able to at all. In particular, performance artists obviously have quite a bit of challenge, but visual artists who use specialized equipment or need teams to do their work had probably the most challenges in terms of the physical constraints and social distancing constraints of COVID. She goes on to talk about the kinds of social things that aren't happening that are really important to her practice. She says, before the pandemic, I would go to a lot of gallery shows and things, and have friends that are also artists, and we would talk about certain things. And there's a whole collective unconscious of ideas that artists fall into. So that influence of not seeing other people's work isn't necessarily there anymore. So she's missing out on some of the influences and experiences that are important to her generating new creative work. Lastly, in terms of interview quotes, I will give one piece of resilience, although overall, I think people who we interviewed experienced much more challenge than resilience in this study, despite the title that we gave it. So Nathaniel Macon is a music composer and works in the theater industry. And he says, we're a bunch of theater makers, and we'd get on these meetings and we'd say, we're making a movie and none of us know how to make a movie. So we're just going to figure out how to make a movie. And so I think you saw a lot of people in the industry sort of shifting. So for Nathaniel, he is financially okay and perhaps doing better than he was before the pandemic. And part of that is that he's been able to expand his skill portfolio, which is really exciting. But also something that has been difficult for him at times, but overall is a story of resilience. He says, pre-pandemic, it was just the medium in which I was working was different. So there was certainly a shift in learning some new skills and figuring out how to collaborate in that way, which wasn't an in-person environment with the same sort of technology. So that part of it has definitely changed. So for him, he's also one of the artists who reflected on the positive benefit that this has had to his health. So working in theater, he talks about the social obligations that happen after a show ends each night, having to go out to a bar and being essentially socially obligated to drink and stay out late and then do it all again the next day. So he's felt like this has been really positive for him creatively in terms of his skills, financially, and in terms of his personal well-being. So as I've kind of discussed on this piece of the study, these artists have seen a loss of psychic rewards and career trajectory. They're also contemplating their work and the opportunities and demands of the cultural sector. So again, thinking about which pieces that they like and which pieces that they might want to change when things go back to whatever our new normal is. There's quite a bit of new skill acquisition, particularly in terms of digital and technological skills. And there's a reliance on different sets of freelance opportunities. So bringing on new clients and new opportunities that they didn't have before. So this specifically is for free agentic or self-employed artists. On the other side of that, designers and employees of corporations seem to be doing quite well. So specifically, all of the designers in this sample said that working from home was great, and their work is perhaps even going more smoothly working for health organizations, large companies, and kind of retail brands online. So we see that the benefits for them of working from home really are this kind of increased autonomy that we would expect. One question that we ask is whether their life is more difficult or easier now. And overall, people said it wasn't necessarily more difficult. And for many, it is easier. So there's a lot going on here and a lot still to parse out with these findings. The place where this piece of the project stands is that I'm currently applying for funding to collect follow-up interviews to look again at the difference in this kind of acute perspective on the COVID crisis compared to the long-term recovery. I do expect that there will be more stories of resilience, creativity, and innovation in 2022 compared to this kind of acute space. And like I said, I'd also like to diversify the sample during these follow-up interviews. Some papers in progress include financial impacts of COVID on individual artists, a question of envisioning the future of the culture sector, and a chapter on working from home in the arts. So next, I will get into the question at hand that I'm going to then turn over to you all and let you tell me what you think I should do. And that's translating these interviews into survey items. So if the project is currently in this place, next, I'd like to get it to getting these survey questions developed and ready to field in the fall of 2022. So these will be fielded on the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project, SNAAP survey. So if you're not familiar with SNAAP, it is a national survey that surveys arts graduates about their educational experiences and career outcomes. And just a note on the sample, so it's individual arts alumni nested within their institutions. So their colleges, universities, or other institutions of higher learning. They have a dual focus mission, so attending to higher education goals and research goals, kind of empirical research goals. And that's something that I've really had to keep in mind during this process, because these questions need to be relevant to the higher education institutions. So sociologist Rachel can't just ask all of the interesting questions that she wants to. It also needs to be relevant to institutional needs. And also, just a note, SNAAP has received a large Mellon Foundation grant to promote inclusivity and diversity in their sample. So that's also just an exciting thing on SNAAP's horizon. The thematic foci of the questions that I'm hoping to put on the survey include a pandemic burden. So how do you measure the overall kind of burden that this pandemic has placed on arts graduates? Education and skill proficiencies, employment status and income changes, resources and support, and institutional support and positive outcomes. So I didn't necessarily expect to put positive outcome questions on this, but many people did note the positive outcome. So I'm hoping that that will make it onto the survey ultimately. So first, getting into the question of pandemic burden, the survey already has a measure of a student debt burden. So I'm trying to kind of mirror that as something that could be a potential long-term indicator of how the pandemic has made people change their career or educational decisions. So that's currently the first question: how much has this pandemic affected your career and educational decisions? But also related to this question, I'm hoping to have an open-ended question describing kind of what impact it's had at all on people's career and educational decisions. And then the third question: how much impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on personal well-being, including physical and mental health? And this is a question I'm still workshopping. I have a collaborator at OSU, Elizabeth Cooksey, who is the PI of the NLSY survey, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and she focuses on sociology of health. So I'm hoping that she'll have some good insights on this piece of it, in addition to any suggestions that you all might have on that front. In terms of education and skill proficiencies, I'm also trying to mirror some existing SNAAP questions that would be relevant to the kind of wording and spacing of questions that are in the typical survey in this kind of piece about COVID. So a question saying, how relevant is your arts training at your institution to your ability to endure the impact of COVID-19 on your career? And then a skills-based question. So SNAAP has a list of skills and abilities that is already existing in other parts of the survey. And so I'm asking, how important were those skills to your ability to endure the impact, again, of the pandemic onto your career? So this includes things like entrepreneurial skills, artistic technique, research skills, teaching skills. You can see the list is quite long and pretty comprehensive. And if people have questions about that set of skills at the end, I have worked with those items quite a bit, so I'm happy to answer any questions as I might be able to. In terms of employment status and income, this I'm really trying to establish change. So asking about changes in employment status and also kind of personal income change, arts-based income change, and household income change. So this might get us toward understanding how arts-based income compared to personal income has changed. So are people taking on additional non-arts employment? Is arts employment just bottoming out? And then if someone's personal income has drastically reduced, but their household income has stayed relatively stable, that can give us some good insight too into how kind of family members and households support their artist members of the family. In terms of resources and support, there is an existing question about resources on the SNAAP survey. So I'm not sure if these will be the actual items, kind of reflecting the existing SNAAP items, but I'm really interested in the types of resources and support that arts graduates have used to kind of make it through. Um, so in terms of, do they need studio space? Do they need equipment? Do they need loans, professional networks? Like, what is it that arts graduates need? Typically in the SNAAP survey, people all say that they want publicity and recognition. So I'm curious to see if that has changed. But then also adding on to that, asking from what sources are people obtaining support during this time? And so this is one that I still haven't kind of settled on the items that might go into it. So institution in brackets would be filled in with whatever the name of their higher education institution is. But also, did they get resources from their social networks, professional networks, the government? And quite a few of the artists who we interviewed got government support. So that was really, it seemed crucial to making the financial piece not the biggest problem that they faced during this time. And then lastly, some potential text box open-ended answers. So what could your institution have done during the pandemic to offer support to you? Again, supporting the relevance of these findings for higher education institutions, and hopefully helping them address any kind of policies or resources that they might use to support alumni or even current students. And then again, this kind of positive outcomes question. What, if any, positive outcomes did you experience during the pandemic? Some analytic considerations that I'm still working through include priming language. How do we talk about this or introduce this piece of the survey in a way that really focuses people's attention to this time period? And again, the question of time period is also really relevant. We found that there's already been changes from the November and December 2020 interviews to the 2021 interviews. People's outlook and experiences are already much more positive. And so again, trying to measure the kind of impact of the pandemic in 2022 might be quite different than what we see in 2020 or 2021. I'm also interested in making sure that there's meaningful use for the open-ended questions. With as big as SNAAP survey sample size is, that could be an issue. And then some, again, meaningful acute versus long-term indicators, like what, if anything, should remain on this survey after 2022. So questions I have for you all, what are there any other thematic foci that might be beneficial in terms of your own research? We always want people to use the SNAAP data, but also for just understanding what's been happening to artists during this time. The utility of COVID-related questions in short and long term. And then just what other questions do you have about what's happening to artists right now? Those are just some introductory ideas, but I'm open to answering or discussing anything that you all want to talk about. So that's what I have for you. And thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel. There's a lot there for us to take in. I see lots of hands going up. Maybe I'll just start with one question from the chat from Sunil from the NEA, which is, are there any potential questions about the use of technology and maybe specific platforms in creating and sharing their work, and whether that helped them earning income?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sunil. We don't have one on the potential SNAAP questions at this point, but I'm going to, got my little notebook ready. I'll go ahead and write that down. And I wonder if anyone has opinions on whether open-ended would be more appropriate for that, because I think that it might be difficult to assess kind of a closed kind of checkbox source at that point. But at the minimum, I think that needs to be included in the resources section. But we did have quite a few interviewees talking about learning new platforms and some kind of difficulty for later career artists in doing that. So having the kind of move to technology, especially for people who weren't already working in that, was challenging, but also was a piece of this skill acquisition kind of across the board in terms of career stage.
Okay, thanks. I see we're getting a lot of questions in the chat, but I have seen a couple of hands go up. Mark Taylor, was your hand raised?
I was just applauding, but I do also have a question.
Okay, that was applauding. I do see Neil's hand up though, so maybe we'll go to Neil Alfer.
Yeah, one quick thought you might consider, and I can't remember what's in the SNAAP data, but one of the things we've found out, or I found out with my colleagues, is many artists and many non-artists have double majors. And it depends in terms of economic success on what those other majors are. And you know, it's a concept or a behavior that seems to be increasing over time in all higher education. And I'm just wondering whether or not SNAAP has that information. And if not, you might take a look at it, because the combinations make a big difference. You know, is it 2 art majors? Is it art and some technology major? Is it art and a business major? Is it an art and a humanities major? And you're talking about targeting or giving information back to the institutions. This is some kind of information I think institutions might be very interested in knowing for their students.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Neil. So SNAAP does have a question about double majors, or at least it asks major 1, major 2. So it kind of goes down the list to allow people to talk about their majors. And my colleague, Alexander Fournette, who I see on the call, he and I have been working with that data and looking to another question that SNAAP has, which is, did you intend to be an artist when you started this degree program? And so we find actually that there's a really interesting group of people who did not intend to be artists, who nevertheless majored in the arts. And typically, well, not typically, a pattern that we're finding is that many of those are double majors. So you have the surgeon or the lawyer who also really wanted to continue their practice as an oboist or as a sculptor. So that's often a pattern that we're finding. And I do know that Stephen Tepper had a report kind of a few years ago now about double majors. And I think that he found that the benefit was typically for people who had disparate majors. So if you're a visual art and media major, there's less of a benefit than someone who is a business major and an art major.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Stephen's report on that. Thanks. But yeah, I mean, and I think I didn't hear it quite as clearly as I think you probably mean, but it seems to me what you want to do, and I know you're going to do it, is pre-COVID behavior and during COVID behavior.
Right.
I think that's important, and especially in terms of sources of income.
Right.
You know, is it from their art work? Is it from their non-arts work? Is it what some economists call, like myself, arts-related work? You know, those are the kinds of differences I think you want to see, and certainly help you out understand how their time allocation changed pre-COVID versus during COVID. And I think that's very interesting to learn about.
I agree. Thank you.
And if I wasn't retired, I'd do it myself, but I'll leave it to the younger researchers.
Okay. A little live question from Joanna.
Thanks, Rachel. Awesome job. So I invited you, and I was a little selfish in doing that because I wanted to figure out what you were working on. But so I kind of piggybacking off of what Neil's saying, I do agree that like the pre and the during is really important. But even thinking a little bit beyond that, I think the most important area to sort of really understand right now is how the structure of the labor force has changed. And in order to figure that out, I think you have to look at sort of the most precarious workers within the artistic labor force, that being like women, people with child care responsibilities, people, minorities, et cetera. So I'm wondering, like, if there is, because, you know, for a lot of these questions, we sort of know what the answer is going to be, right? It's been really hard. But that being said, within that broad answer, there's those people who have done really, really well because they've somehow been able to maneuver their work environment so that they can actually be more productive, right? And that's obviously important to understand as well. But then there's these people who have not been able to do that. And if we just ask these sort of, how are you doing? We're going to get these broad level answers that are not going to give us into any insight into sort of how we can support those people who have not been doing very well, and that have ultimately, because they've either left the labor force or changed their practice, like have changed the nature of the labor force, so changed the actual structure. So I'm wondering, like, are there opportunities with any of the next waves of the SNAAP sample, but or even just of your interviewing, to just really oversample those really precarious or vulnerable subpopulations within artistic graduates.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I think that that's been perhaps the challenge on the survey development piece, you know, having questions that are relevant to 50,000 people. But in the interviews, absolutely, the people, again, we didn't find too many people who were economically struggling to the point of breaking. And I think that probably, you know, who has time to go and be interviewed by someone if you like are you know, an essential worker who's like working at the grocery store and also delivering for Uber and like hasn't picked up a paintbrush or recorded anything since last March. So that's definitely a downside, right? Like who has time to be part of this if you're not at least having some autonomy over your time. But I would like to absolutely oversample and add to the sample in addition to the follow-up interviews in the future. And I think that there are some potential kind of partnerships or ways that I could do that. But I also would definitely be open to suggestions on ways to achieve that. And we did find, especially the kind of parenting burden, the caregiving, not just parenting, caregiving burdens in general, were kind of the thing that was super characteristic of those folks who felt the loss of opportunity, the loss of psychic benefit, and the idea that perhaps their career trajectory would be cut off, not just that this is hard now, but that there are opportunities that are being missed that cannot be made up. And those were mostly kind of mid-career folks. The early career people seem to be more able to take advantage of new opportunities or acquire new skills. But again, I'm guessing that we're seeing people who, again, have enough autonomy and embeddedness within their arts field that they are able to do that. And this is perhaps a challenge of the arts graduates focus too, because I would expect that many of the artists who are most precarious are those who are not coming from graduating from an arts BA or MA or PhD program. So absolutely, I think that perhaps is one of the things that I could do to be most effective in that oversampling is expanding the sample beyond arts graduates in the follow-up study. But again, I'm open to more things.
Just in complementing your work too, you could look at the large scale census surveys too, which I'm already doing. So we should maybe connect offline because then you could sort of get that overlay and then be able to look at those very, you know, particular subpopulations. And then, you know, again, talking very selfishly, you know, being able to then color that work by the interviews that you're doing, I think would be extremely beneficial.
Yeah, I also selfishly was very happy to see that your topic of your workshop earlier this semester was on this similar topic. So yeah, let's definitely connect about that.
Okay. In the chat, Raquel Jimenez and Doug Noonan have a similar question, which is how are you framing, or if you are framing the question to alums of, based on with the experience of the pandemic, what skills do you wish you had learned, especially tech skills, in your degree program? And this would obviously be of interest to the schools that SNAAP is representing.
Right, absolutely. And that's, again, the timing question is one that I'm really trying to work out in the priming language for this piece of the SNAAP survey, because those skills questions, the way that they're asked on the survey is initially which of these skills and abilities did you get at your institutions and which do you need for your career? And so we do find gaps, and this is another area of research that my colleagues and I are doing right now, is looking at those skills gaps and what predicts the kind of negative skills, or the skills gap in specifically business and entrepreneurial skills, which is quite large.
Okay, I see Tracy Hudak's hand is up there.
I'm wondering if, in terms of the resources and support dimension, if it would be useful for your work or for the work at large to distinguish between local resource and support versus general government and general nonprofit. One, both to correlate or with psychic well-being, like am I part of a system that is supportive, that I, you know, and then secondly, on the entrepreneurship dimension and for institutional knowledge, are artists accessing local small business support systems, your SBA office and things like that, which I think when we're talking about entrepreneurship, there's business management, there's hustle, there's, finding out what are the local resources, that kind of thing. So just wondering if that dimension might be helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Tracy. And I think that dimension comes out in the interviews some. We ask, where did you get the resources you need? And so many talk about mutual aid groups on social media. So it's like, okay, I got unemployment and social media helped me figure out how to get everything else done. So I think if there are ways to figure out that kind of structural versus associational support, kind of what you're saying, I think that would be really valuable and probably research relevant and relevant to the institutions.
Okay. Doug, I've seen your hand up for a while there.
Yeah, all right. So good stuff, Rachel. Thanks, of course. And so the part I'm personally very interested in is this resilience piece. And I think that, I don't know what you can do in the confines of a survey, but maybe there's something. I wonder though, as interpreting these interviews, it sounds a lot like resilience is almost implicitly in vulnerability, and it's not, and it shouldn't be. And I think if we think, oh, well, they're being really hard hit, so they're not being resilient, that's not what resilience would be. It's more the ability to bounce back. And in some ways it's too soon. Now, at the time this goes to field or you do your follow-ups, it'll be a different story. But I'd be interested in learning, even in real time, what is being done to weather the storm as more a form of resilience rather than asking whether or not there was a storm, which kind of gets at Joanna's point. Like a lot of the things we know, there was a storm, it hit, yes. And I'm curious what they're doing to survive the storm. And there's a lot of basic things at a core level that you could actually probably put in a survey. Things like, are you drawing down on reserves? And by reserves, in what form are those reserves taking? Financial, social, psychic reserves? There's a bunch of different reserves you could be drawing down. Maybe they're adapting their practices, finding new markets. Maybe they're actually learning new skills. And maybe they're taking time away from all of this and working on, tax accounting, and maybe as a temporary thing or something more permanent. But there's a lot of different forms that the resilience piece can take that I think you can ask about. And it's a lot more interesting, I think, than saying, how hard did this hit you? Because I'm not sure how much I would use a response from somebody during this. I would be much more interested in knowing sort of how it hit you is my.
Yeah, thank you for that framing of kind of drawing on reserves. So we did have people talk about using savings, obviously, and people talking about being emotionally broken, right? Like the kind of end of those reserves, but that framing of like, what are you drawing upon? Not just in terms of accessing support, but resources can be obviously internal resources also. And I don't think that we have good language right now talking about that or framing that for kind of extant knowledge.
Interesting question for us instructors as well. I see Alexandra Primet.
Yes, thank you. Great talk, Rachel. This is actually my first time hearing about this work, and I'm super excited about it. I will continue the tradition that we've just noticed of mentioning things that we're personally interested in. I'm personally interested in the impact of age and career stage, and I think Jennifer Novak-Leonard just actually asked that question in the chat, which is the role of career stage in terms of, as part of the study. You mentioned that your qualitative data is mostly based on interviews with early to mid-career stage. And you also mentioned the maybe paradoxical role of career stage and technological skills, not to be ageist in this, but there seems to be maybe more ease in terms of developing and using certain technological skills in the early career stage. But there also seems to be more of a normalization of precariousness at the early career stage, right? So maybe that partly explains why your results so far tend to be kind of positive and rosy for the early career stage. But my concern is that the COVID, the impacts of COVID pandemic and another recession, really would lead to sort of a lost generation of arts graduates. So I'm not sure if this is something that's already on your mind, but I wanted to see if this is something you could comment on.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. In terms of ageism, I don't think that it's an age thing. I think that we see in SNAAP studies that people are getting more technological skills training the closer, like the younger career generation they are. So I think that people who are more recent graduates have had more relevant technological training to the current state. But as any of us who are, probably any of us, but especially any of us who are faculty members right now know, like, learning a new technology has, challenges that come with it, especially when learned under duress. I think you're right too. I hadn't thought about, in addition to learning relevant technological skills, our more recent arts graduates have also learned precariousness as part of the expected career trajectory. So perhaps there's something there, again, connecting back to what Doug said in terms of being able to weather or draw upon reserves. Perhaps their reserves are more suited to precarious times. But of the kind of more recent graduates who I spoke with, many of them do feel that, again, this potential loss of career trajectory just as they're getting started. So some have withdrawn from courses of study or have moved away from employment toward self-employment as a way to protect against the market. So there's a lot happening there and definitely more to look into. So thank you for that. Again, the framing, all these framings are very helpful to me to get outside of my own mindset on the interviews and survey development so far.
Mark, now I see it.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Rachel. Continuing the theme that Alex has identified around asking questions on things we're interested in. I'm particularly interested, and I think this sort of building on some analysis we've been sort of trying to do and struggling with in the UK, is of those people who had been working in the arts and are no longer doing so, people who aren't getting as many hours, people who are, suffering redundancies. There's this big question of where it is they're going. Because, some of the roles that you talked about, becoming an Uber driver, some of the sort of stereotypes like working in a cafe or in a bar, those jobs are all gone. And I was particularly struck by the first question that you flagged being this question about, what has the pandemic done for your career and your educational aspirations? Because one of the things that we're seeing here is a big increase in the number of people applying for master's degrees. And I think if you work in a university, you think that's great, until you realize the reason why people are applying for master's degrees is because they sort of feel like they don't have any options. So any sense of figuring out what's happening to people who are leaving the labour market, whether in 12 months' time they'll be able to come back much better than before because they've been working on an ambitious project, or whether they've just been squeezed out?
Yeah, great question, Mark. And something that something I didn't talk about here is reliance on other SNAAP questions. And so I'm hoping to see the difference so we ask about, people who are going back for additional degrees. And I expect to see that we have a higher proportion than usual of those probably young and early mid-career people who are going back to get degrees, whether it be in the arts or in something else altogether. But I think that's so important, thinking about what are their opt-out options, right? Like, where are they going instead of where they've been, I guess. And while I didn't get a sense of that in the interviews, again, this is, I didn't conduct all of these interviews and I haven't analyzed them all yet. But I think it's something that's on people's minds about kind of what their options are. And again, we've seen some people kind of leave school, like leave a course of study, and some people who seem to be fine. I also, for this project, conducted interviews with the SNAAP board members who are provosts, deans, leaders in their art schools. And there's been kind of a split. Some people have seen really high levels of like additional applicants. And I know that within my own university at Ohio State, we're seeing our largest classes ever. And so I think that there's some interesting trends in enrollment that have to do with risk allocation. So are you willing to move across the country to go to the art-specific school, or should you stay at home and do the kind of state university program that's nearby and maybe less expensive, less risky, and more likely to be able to serve your needs if you're going online? So I think there's a lot of kind of risk and kind of return on investment thinking that's happening at the university level, at the student level, and at the parent level. So there's so much going on right now, but thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. It brings to Mark's question brings to mind two questions that come up in the chat. One from Dave O'Brien is asking about what do we know about other countries, and obviously you've been in touch with other surveys that maybe are there U.S. specific things we're seeing here, or is this just the arts internationally? Michael Seaman has also asked, are you going to ask about people picking up additional work? Like, are they grabbing something at, as Mark says, you know, like the cafe jobs are gone, but there's always the Amazon warehouse or things like that, or driving. Are you going to ask any specific questions like that?
Right. So Dave, I have it on my agenda to connect with you later this month. I put that on my calendar earlier this year, so I noticed that you should be expecting an email from me soon. The literature review that we did is encompassing of kind of English language scholarship around the world, and so it does seem like these patterns are obviously global, but at the same time, I think that the kind of US welfare state compared to other countries puts us in a different position that's perhaps made people act entrepreneurially in ways they haven't in the past. But also we have artists who have not had an easy access to government support in the past in terms of unemployment, all be eligible for unemployment, surprisingly. So I'm really excited to the paper that I'm thinking through on financial impact toward individual artists. A lot of it is thinking about, like, these artists have not typically had access to unemployment, and now they have. And so how has that impacted them, and what has been the positive impact on career persistence because of unemployment payments? So I'm excited about that, and excited to connect with you later and talk more about that, as well as if anyone else. I know that Poetics is kind of collecting a group of people who are interested in this topic, and I'd be interested if there are any other kinds of research networks globally that are working toward these topics. And then Michael, in terms of extra work that people are taking on, I think that that's important that we add that to the survey questions, finding a way to kind of maybe what I think it was Neil who talked about time allocation, and perhaps even just a measure of working hours before and after, or a change in working hours, even just kind of a positive, negative trend would be really helpful, I think. So thank you for putting that on my mind.
In the chat, Jeff Krosick raises an interesting issue. So your study is focused on asking arts graduates, what has your life been like, and what things are happening out there to you. But there's sort of a longer term follow-up question, which is, how does that actually impact the rest of the world? And as Jeff points out, often freelance artists are the people who connect different organizations. They are the link between often sort of nonprofit traditional arts and other parts of the creative economy. And are we going to end up, as we suffer losses from an individual perspective from the pandemic, are we losing something bigger as well in terms of what these individuals actually did for the entire economy, not just on their own value added, but on all of the externalities that arise from that? So that might be beyond your scope, but I'll let you address it.
Yeah, I think it is a little beyond my scope, but is I think right on target. Just thinking about that article by Buchholz, Fine, and Wohl, that the issue of like what people are missing socially, this not even just socially, but in terms of without face-to-face, not having the kind of connective power, mutual understanding, and trust that is kind of built into the system that they're used to working within. I think that is probably something that needs to be explored more, and I think could be looked at in terms of the kind of connecting roles or community-focused roles that artists take on. And while I haven't looked at that, and while, as Doug said, like maybe it's too early to know about the resilience piece of this, or the kind of opportunity generation piece of this, I do think that if we're looking, a year or two out, that'll give us maybe a better time period to look at this, because at least the initial interviews that we did, I think that people were still in, shelter mode in a lot of ways, not just sheltering at home, but kind of just The unknowedness of it all was much more strong than even now. So even just the idea that there is a vaccine, that many people are getting it, and that hope is on the horizon, I think has already changed people's outlooks and behaviors. So I think that that's also an issue of time.
Okay. That brings us to 1 o'clock, and I look at the chat and I see beyond the window I have 23 new messages. So obviously we're not going to be able to come to them. Now, Casey, am I correct that with this having been recorded, all of the chat is saved?
Yes, I'll have a copy of the chat, so I can forward that along to you, Rachel.
Okay.
Thank you. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to follow up, and I'm happy to share my interview guide or other materials if anyone else is conducting similar research.
Okay, well, I think the amount of discussion you've generated here and the number of questions and the amount of feedback, it's been a wonderful hour. This is really important work. And I know I've learned a lot about, sort of what the big questions are, what are the things we still have to learn. And so I want to thank you so much, the mid-semester at this busy time for being able to share your work in progress with us. And we really look forward to seeing how this progresses and reading some of your results. But thank you so much, Rachel, on behalf of all of us.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the feedback and the questions, and I'm looking forward to getting that chat box.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And we will say to everyone else, have a great rest of the day, or if you're on the other side of the Atlantic, a great evening. All right. Cheers, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye, y'all.